The morning sun had barely crept over the dusty hills when Jonas Gage first laid eyes on Willow Ridge. It wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered buildings huddled together like cattle in a storm, their wooden facades bleached gray by years of prairie wind and unforgiving sun. The main street stretched no more than a quarter mile, lined with the usual establishments. A general store, a smithy belching black smoke, a saloon already showing signs of life despite the early hour, and a modest church whose white paint was peeling like old skin. Jonas shifted the weight of his pack, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders. 2 years of wandering had taught him to travel light, but even the essentials grew heavy after walking since dawn. His boots, worn thin at the soles, kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. He'd need new ones soon, if he could find work that paid enough. The old quarry lay just beyond the town's edge, abandoned these past 5 years according to the fellow he'd met on the trail. Good enough place to make camp, the man had said, if you don't mind the ghosts. Jonas didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in keeping away from people who might ask too many questions about a stranger's past. He'd stopped at the boarding house first, a 2-story building with lace curtains that seemed out of place in this rough country. The woman who answered, Mrs. Harlan, according to the sign, took one look at his travel-stained clothes and the week's worth of stubble on his jaw and shook her head before he could even speak. No rooms, she said, though Jonas could see through the doorway to a board listing several vacancies. I can pay, he offered, reaching for the leather pouch at his belt. No rooms for drifters, she clarified, her mouth pursing like she'd tasted something sour. Try the saloon. They're less particular about their clientele. The door closed with a definitive click. Jonas stood there a moment, letting the rejection settle into his bones alongside all the others. He'd grown accustomed to it, this look people gave him, part fear, part disgust, as if poverty and solitude were diseases that might spread. He turned away without argument. Fighting it only made things worse. The saloon keeper proved no more welcoming, and Jonas didn't bother trying the hotel. He knew the pattern by now. Instead, he made his way toward the quarry, passing modest homes that grew sparser as the road led out of town. Most were simple structures, built for function rather than beauty, with small gardens struggling against the dry soil. One house stood apart from the others, not in grandeur but in its careful maintenance. Despite the faded blue paint and sagging porch, someone had taken pains to keep it tidy. Morning glories climbed a trellis beside the door, their purple blooms a splash of color in the brown landscape. The garden, while small, showed signs of constant attention, neat rows of vegetables, stakes carefully placed to support tomato plants. Not a weed in sight. Jonas noticed all this in passing, his mind already on finding suitable shelter near the quarry. But as he drew alongside the property, movement on the porch caught his eye. A woman emerged from the house, carrying something wrapped in a checkered cloth. She was perhaps 40 years of age, with dark hair streaked with premature silver, pulled back in a simple bun. Her dress, though mended in several places, was clean and pressed. She moved with quiet purpose. Setting the bundle on the porch rail, their eyes met across the dusty yard. Jonas expected her to retreat immediately, as most women did when confronted with a strange man's gaze. Instead, she held his look for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned and went back inside, leaving the bundle on the rail. Jonas continued walking, but something made him glance back. The bundle remained where she'd left it, and now he caught the scent carrying on the morning breeze, fresh bread, still warm from the oven. His stomach clenched with a hunger he'd learned to ignore. The quarry proved to be as the traveler had described, a great gouge in the earth, its limestone walls rising like ancient fortifications. Abandoned equipment lay scattered about, slowly being reclaimed by rust and weather. Jonas found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang, where previous vagrants had obviously camped. A circle of blackened stones marked an old fire pit, and someone had even constructed a rough lean-to against the rock face. He set about making the space habitable, clearing away debris and checking for snakes. The work felt good after days of walking. Physical labor had always settled his mind, gave his hands something to do besides remember skills he could no longer use. By the time he'd gathered wood for a fire and unpacked his few belongings, the sun had climbed higher, warming the air. His thoughts kept returning to the woman and her bundle. In 2 years of traveling, he'd grown accustomed to hostile looks, slammed doors, and muttered curses. Kindness, if that's what it had been, sat uneasily on him, like a coat that didn't quite fit. Come evening, Jonas made his way back toward town, needing to fill his water bottles and perhaps purchase a few supplies if the general store would serve him. He took a different route, one that wouldn't pass the Blue House, but found himself on that street anyway, as if his feet had their own intentions. The bundle was still there. Jonas stopped, genuinely surprised. Surely someone else would have taken it by now, a passing child, a hungry dog, anyone. But there it sat, untouched on the porch rail, the checkered cloth moving slightly in the evening breeze. He approached slowly, half expecting someone to burst from the house and accuse him of theft. The windows remained dark, curtains drawn. Up close, the smell of bread was overwhelming. His mouth watered despite himself. A small note was tucked beneath the cloth, written in a careful hand. For the traveler. Jonas stood there, holding the warm bundle, trying to understand. He'd been called many things these past 2 years: drifter, vagrant, saddle tramp, worse, but traveler held a dignity he'd forgotten existed. He looked at the dark windows again, wondering about the woman inside. What kind of person left fresh bread for a stranger who looked like he did? Either a saint or a fool, and he'd met precious few of either in his wanderings. The bread, when he finally unwrapped it back at his camp, was everything the smell had promised. Heavy and wholesome, with a crust that crackled when he tore it and an interior still soft with warmth. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to make it last. It had been months since he'd tasted bread that wasn't stale or moldy, bought cheap from backcountry stores. As darkness settled over the quarry and his small fire pushed back the shadows, Jonas found himself thinking about debts and payments. He'd learned to live without owing anyone anything. It was safer that way. Cleaner. But this bread sat heavy in his stomach, not with discomfort but with obligation. Someone had given freely to him, asked nothing in return. The gesture unsettled him more than any hostility could have. In town, behind the drawn curtains of the Blue House, Sarah Ellen Mackenzie sat at her kitchen table, mending a torn apron by lamplight. She'd watched from her bedroom window as the stranger finally took the bread, had seen the way he'd stood there studying her note. Tomorrow. The town gossips would have something new to whisper about: crazy Sarah leaving food for vagrants, inviting trouble to their doorsteps. Let them talk. They'd been talking for 3 years now, ever since Jed died, and the whispers started about poison and murder and a wife who knew too much about herbs. She'd recognized something in the stranger's bearing, the way he'd carried rejection from Mrs. Harlan's boarding house without protest or anger, just acceptance, tired and thorough. She knew that particular weight, had carried it herself these 3 years. It had moved her to action before she could think better of it. Sarah set aside her mending and prepared for bed. moving through her evening routines with practiced efficiency. Tomorrow she'd need to be at the schoolhouse early. She still had papers to grade, though the school board constantly threatened to dismiss her. Only the lack of other willing teachers kept her employed. That and the fact that she worked for half what they'd paid her predecessor. Outside, a coyote howled somewhere in the distance, and another answered. The sound didn't frighten her anymore. The real predators, she'd learned, walked on two legs and wore respectable clothes. They smiled while they destroyed you, quoted scripture while they spread lies, offered condolences while they counted the coins they'd stolen. She thought again of the stranger, wondered where he was sheltering tonight. The quarry, most likely. It's where they all went, the ones passing through. By tomorrow or the next day, he'd be gone, moved on to somewhere that might offer work or at least warmer welcome than Willow Ridge provided. But Jonas Gage, belly full of good bread for the first time in months, wasn't thinking of moving on. He was thinking of debts and how to repay them, of morning glories climbing a trellis and a woman who'd looked at him and seen a traveler instead of a threat. He was thinking of the loose boards he'd noticed on her porch, the gate that hung crooked, the 100 small repairs a house needed when there was no man around to tend them. He'd stay a few days. He decided, long enough to even the scales. Do the work at night, maybe, when she wouldn't see and couldn't protest. Then he'd move on. Debt paid, conscience clear. It was a good plan, a sensible plan. The kind of plan a man made when he didn't yet understand that some debts only grew heavier with paying, and some kindnesses, once accepted, changed the shape of a life forever. The whispers started at Hartley's General Store, as most whispers in Willow Ridge did. Mrs. Hartley, a woman who collected gossip like others collected stamps, had spotted Sarah's bread on the porch rail and drawn her own conclusions. Mark my words, she told Mrs. Patterson while measuring out flour. That woman's inviting trouble right to our doorsteps. First it was the herbs and potions. Now she's feeding vagrants. What next? Mrs. Patterson, whose chief entertainment consisted of other people's misfortunes, leaned in closer. I heard she was seen talking to that drifter who's camping at the quarry. Bold as brass, right there on Main Street. This was a lie, but in Willow Ridge, truth rarely got in the way of a good story. By noon, half the town knew that Sarah Mackenzie was consorting with dangerous strangers, and by evening, the tale had grown to include midnight meetings and all manner of impropriety. Jonas knew nothing of this. He'd spent the morning at the quarry, fashioning tools from the abandoned equipment, a makeshift hammer from a broken pickaxe head and a sturdy branch, a saw blade cleaned of rust and fitted with a new handle. The work occupied his hands while his mind wandered, as it often did, to the life he'd left behind. 2 years ago, he'd worn a badge and commanded respect in a town not unlike this one. He'd believed in law then, in justice and the power of truth to prevail over corruption. That belief had cost him everything, his position, his home, very nearly his life. The mayor he'd tried to expose had friends in high places, and Jonas had learned that sometimes the law itself could be twisted into a weapon against those who tried to uphold it. He pushed the memories aside and focused on the task at hand. Tonight, he'd return to the Blue House and fix that sagging gate, a simple job, one that would partially repay the debt of bread. He'd work quietly, leave before dawn, and the woman, Mrs. Mackenzie, he'd learned her name from overheard conversation in town, would wake to find the repair completed. But first, he needed supplies. The general store was his only option, though he dreaded the reception he'd likely receive. He cleaned himself as best he could at the creek, even shaved with his old razor, trying to appear less threatening. It was a futile effort. Poverty and wandering left marks that soap couldn't wash away, The store was busy when he entered. Several women clustered near the fabric counter. Their chatter died instantly, replaced by a silence so complete he could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Jonas kept his eyes on the floor, moved directly to the shelves holding nails and hinges. "Help you?" Mr. Hartley's tone suggested he'd rather do anything, but "You need some nails," Jonas said quietly. "Hinges too, if you've got them. You planning on settling here?" The question carried an edge of warning. "No, sir. Just some repairs to pay off a debt." Hartley's eyes narrowed. "What kind of debt?" Before Jonas could answer, one of the women near the fabric counter spoke up. "He's the one Sarah's been feeding. Saw him myself, bold as brass, taking charity off her porch." Jonas recognized the voice. Mrs. Patterson, who'd crossed the street rather than pass him on the sidewalk yesterday. He kept his attention on the shelves, selected what he needed. "Mrs. Mackenzie's got enough troubles without adding yours," Hartley said. "Best you move along. Forget whatever debt you think you owe." "A man pays his debts," Jonas replied, setting the items on the counter. "How much?" Hartley named a price nearly double what the items were worth. Jonas paid without argument, though it took most of his remaining money. He pocketed the nails and hinges, turned to leave. "You stay away from that woman," Mrs. Patterson called after him. "She's got darkness enough around her without you adding to it." Outside, Jonas paused to let his anger settle. He'd heard the whispers about Sarah Mackenzie. Poison, they said. Murder dressed up as illness. He didn't believe it. He'd known killers, had arrested enough of them to recognize the signs. The woman who'd left him bread had tired eyes and work-worn hands, not the calculating look of someone who'd taken a life. At the blacksmith shop, the story was much the same, though the smith himself, a giant of a man named Anders, seemed more amused than hostile by the town's reaction. "You're the fellow got the good Christians all riled up," Anders observed, pumping the bellows. "Must be something special about you to cause such a fuss." "Just passing through," Jonas said. "Need to borrow a hammer if you've got one to spare." "Borrow?" Anders laughed. "And how do I know I'll get it back?" "You don't, but I'll return it tomorrow, you have my word." Something in Jonas's tone must have convinced him, because Anders gestured to a row of tools hanging on the wall. "Take the one with the wrapped handle. Grip's better." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Anders said. "Word of advice? Whatever you're planning with the widow Mackenzie, think twice. This town's got a long memory and a short temper when it comes to her." "I'm just fixing a gate." "Sure you are." Anders turned back to his work. "Just remember, sometimes trying to help someone makes things worse for them, especially here." That evening, Jonas waited until full dark before approaching the Blue House. The street was quiet, most folks already settled in for the night. He'd expected to find the house dark as well, but a soft light glowed in what must be the kitchen window. He moved quietly to the gate, examined it in the moonlight. The hinges were rusted through, the wood split where screws had pulled loose. A proper fix would take more than the hour or two he'd planned. He set to work anyway, trying to minimize noise as he removed the old hardware. He'd been working perhaps 20 minutes when the front door opened. Jonas froze, hammer in mid-swing, as Sarah Mackenzie stepped onto the porch. She carried a kerosene lamp, its light casting dancing shadows across the yard. "You'll work better with more light," she said simply, as if finding a stranger repairing her gate at night was perfectly ordinary. Jonas lowered the hammer. "I didn't mean to disturb you, ma'am. I'll go." "No need." She came down the steps, set the lamp on a fence post where it would illuminate his work. "I've been listening to you try to be quiet for the past 20 minutes. Figured you might as well see what you're doing." Up close, he could see the lines around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion. Her dress was different from this morning but showed the same careful maintenance, clean, pressed, mended with tiny, precise stitches. "This isn't necessary," she said, gesturing at the gate. "The bread wasn't. I didn't expect payment." "Man pays his debts," Jonas repeated what he'd said in the store. She studied him for a long moment. "You're not from around here?" "No, ma'am, just passing through." "Where from?" The question was gently asked, but Jonas felt his shoulders tense. "East a ways, Colorado, most recently." "You speak like an educated man." He didn't respond to that, focused on aligning the new hinge. Sarah didn't press, but she didn't leave either. She stood quietly, holding the gate steady while he worked. Her presence should have made him nervous. He'd grown unaccustomed to company, but instead he found it oddly peaceful. "They talk about me in town," she said suddenly. "I imagine you've heard the stories." Jonas kept working. "I've heard them." "Now do you believe them?" He straightened, met her eyes directly. "No, ma'am, I don't." "Why not?" The question deserved an honest answer. Jonas set down the hammer, chose his words carefully. "I've known killers, Mrs. Mackenzie. You're not one." She was quiet for a moment, then, "You speak from experience." "Yes? Were you a lawman?" The question hit too close to truth. Jonas picked up the hammer again, drove in a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. "Once. Not anymore." Sarah didn't pursue it, but he felt her watching him, evaluating. After a moment, she spoke again. "My husband was like you. He noticed things others missed, asked questions people didn't want asked. It killed him in the end." "The poison?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what they're calling it now?" "No. Mr. I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Gage, Jonas Gage." "Mr. Gage. My husband died of an illness, yes, but not poison, not the kind you put in food anyway. He died of knowing too much about the wrong people's business." Jonas's hands stilled on the gate. He understood that kind of poison all too well. The slow kill of threats and pressure. The wearing down of a good man until his body gave out from the strain. "I'm sorry for your loss. Are you?" She tilted her head, studying him. "Most people who say that don't mean it. But I think you might." They stood in silence while Jonas finished the repair. The gate now swung smoothly, latching properly for the first time in who knew how long. He gathered his tools, preparing to leave. "Thank you," Sarah said, "no, for the gate, and for believing I'm not a murderer. You'd be surprised how rare that is these days." "Thank you for the bread," Jonas replied. It had been a long time since anyone showed me kindness without wanting something in return. She smiled then, a real smile that briefly erased the worry lines from her face. "We're a pair, aren't we? The suspected poisoner and the drifter. No wonder the town's in an uproar. I'll be moving on soon. The talk will die down. Will you?" She picked up the lamp, turned toward the house. "That's a shame. It's been nice. Talking to someone who doesn't look at me like I might murder them in their sleep." She paused at the porch steps, looked back. "There's more work needs doing if you're interested. The chicken coop's falling apart, and I can't afford, that is, I'd pay what I could. Room and board, maybe, and a little besides." Jonas knew he should say no. Staying would only bring her more trouble, more whispers. But the thought of regular meals, honest work, and those rare moments of genuine conversation. "I'll think on it," he heard himself say. She nodded, unsurprised by his caution. "The offer stands whenever you decide. Good night, Mr. Gage." Good night, Mrs. Mackenzie. Jonas walked back to the quarry, his thoughts churning. He'd meant to leave tomorrow, had planned it even as he'd fixed the gate. But something held him back. Not just the offer of work, but the woman herself. The quiet dignity with which she bore the town's suspicion. The way she'd stood in the lamplight and spoken of her husband's death with such contained grief. He understood being falsely accused, understood the weight of other people's lies. Maybe that's why he'd believed her so readily. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he was just tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of treating every kindness with suspicion. At the quarry, he built up his fire and sat staring into the flames. Tomorrow. The smart thing would be to pack up and leave, move on to the next town, the next rejection, the next cold night alone. But he thought of Sarah Mackenzie's chicken coop falling apart, of work that needed doing and a woman who deserved better than the hand she'd been dealt. He thought of bread freely given and gates that now swung straight and true. By the time the fire burned low, Jonas had made his decision. He'd stay, at least for a while. Fix what needed fixing, earn his keep, and maybe, just maybe, find something he'd thought lost forever. A place where someone looked at him and saw a man worth trusting. He didn't yet understand that Sarah had made her own decision that night, standing in her kitchen after he'd gone. She'd decided to fight back against the whispers, to stop hiding behind drawn curtains and careful silence. If the town wanted to gossip about her association with Jonas Gage, she'd give them something worth talking about. Neither of them could have guessed where that mutual decision would lead, or that Pastor Levi Morton was already making plans of his own, plans that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with keeping old secrets buried. The spring storm announced itself with a wall of black clouds rolling in from the west, turning the afternoon sky the color of old pewter. Jonas had been working on Sarah's chicken coop since dawn, replacing rotted boards and reinforcing the frame. He'd accepted her offer 3 days ago, moving his few belongings from the quarry to the small shed behind her house. It wasn't much, just a cot, a washstand, and hooks for his clothes, but it was dry and private, more than he'd had in months. Sarah had been teaching at the schoolhouse all day. Jonas could see the building from where he worked, a modest structure with a bell tower that the wind was already causing to sway. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the ground as he hammered in the last board, and within minutes, the drops became a deluge. He secured his tools and was heading for the shed when he noticed something wrong with Sarah's roof. The wind had lifted several shingles, and water was already streaming through the gap. If not fixed immediately, the damage would spread, potentially ruining the interior ceiling and walls. Jonas didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ladder from beside the house and climbed up, fighting against the wind that tried to tear him loose. The rain came sideways now, stinging his face like tiny needles. He could see where the shingles had torn away, exposing the wooden underlayment. Working by feel as much as sight, he began emergency repairs, using boards from the pile he'd set aside for the chicken coop. He was securing the makeshift patch when lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that shook the house. In the brief illumination, he saw Sarah running from the schoolhouse, her dark dress plastered to her form by the rain, one hand holding her bonnet while the other clutched a bundle of books. She stopped dead when she saw him on the roof, her face tilted up into the rain. Even from that height, he could see her expression shift from surprise to alarm. "Hey, get down!" she shouted over the storm. "It's too dangerous!" Jonas waved to show he'd heard, but continued working. Another few minutes and he'd have the worst of it covered. Sarah disappeared into the house, and he assumed she'd gone to get dry. But moments later, he heard the window in the attic open, and she appeared, holding out a rope. "Tie yourself off," she called. "The wind!" As if to prove her point, a gust nearly tore Jonas from his perch. He grabbed the rope gratefully, secured it around his waist, and anchored the other end to the chimney. Working together, him outside, her passing materials through the window, they managed to patch the damaged section just as the storm reached its full fury. When Jonas finally climbed down, he was soaked through, his hands numb from cold and exertion. Sarah met him at the back door with towels and a blanket. "Get inside," she ordered, her schoolteacher voice brooking no argument. "The shed's fine. The shed has half an inch of water on the floor. I looked. You'll catch your death out there. Now come in before I drag you in. Too tired and cold to argue." Jonas followed her into the kitchen. She'd already stoked the stove and put water on to boil. The warmth hit him like a physical thing, making him realize just how chilled he'd become. "Sit," Sarah commanded, pointing to a chair near the stove. "I'll make tea." Jonas sat acutely aware that he was dripping on her clean floor. "I'm making a mess. Floors can be mopped." She busied herself with the tea things, not looking at him. Roofs, on the other hand, are considerably harder to replace. "Thank you. It's what I'm here for." She turned then, fixing him with a look he couldn't quite read. "Is it? Most hired men would have waited for better weather. You could have been killed up there." Jonas shrugged, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "Waiting would have meant more damage. Made sense to fix it now." Sarah poured the tea, set a cup before him. Her hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly. "My husband used to do the same thing. Rush out in storms to fix whatever was breaking. I'd scold him for it, but secretly I was grateful. There's something reassuring about a man who sees what needs doing and does it, regardless of the weather." She sat across from him, cradling her own cup. The storm continued to rage outside, rain drumming against the windows. But inside the kitchen was warm and peaceful. Jonas found himself relaxing for the first time in days. "Tell me about Colorado," Sarah said suddenly. "What made you leave?" The question caught him off guard. He'd become adept at deflecting personal inquiries. But something about the kitchen's warmth, the tea, and Sarah's patient attention made him want to answer honestly. "I was sheriff in a town called Millbrook," he began slowly. "Not much bigger than Willow Ridge. Good place, good people, or so I thought." He stared into his tea, seeing the past in its depths. The mayor, Franklin Wells, was well liked, generous with the church, helped folks in need. Everyone thought he was a saint. But he wasn't. He was embezzling from the town funds, small amounts at first, then larger. When the new school needed repairs, he diverted the money to his own accounts, told everyone the territorial government had denied the funding. Kids went without proper heat all winter while he built himself a new house. Sarah's expression hardened. "How did you find out?" "The bookkeeper got drunk one night, let something slip. I started investigating, quiet-like. Found evidence, ledgers with double entries, forged documents, enough to convict him twice over." "What happened?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "Wells had friends, powerful ones. Before I could present the evidence to a judge, I was accused of taking bribes from local criminals. They had witnesses, people I'd trusted, people whose kids I'd taught to fish, swearing they'd seen me take money. The evidence I'd gathered mysteriously disappeared. Within a week, I'd lost my badge, my home, everything. But surely people knew you better than that." He laughed bitterly. "People believe what's convenient. Wells kept his reputation. I lost mine. They gave me a choice: leave town immediately or face trial with his hand-picked judge and jury. I left." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'm sorry. It's a particular kind of pain, isn't it? being condemned for someone else's crimes. You'd know about that. She nodded, rose to refill their cups. Jed, my husband, he found something similar. Discrepancies in the church building fund. Money meant for expansion going to personal accounts. He was careful, methodical, gathering proof. But he made the mistake of confronting the person responsible directly, giving them a chance to make it right. Let me guess, they didn't take it? No. 2 weeks later, Jed fell ill after the church social. Violent stomach pains, fever, confusion. The doctor said it was food poisoning, maybe from bad meat. But I knew Jed hadn't eaten anything others hadn't also consumed. He lingered for 3 days. Tried to tell me something at the end, but she trailed off, lost in memory. That's when the rumors started? Almost immediately. How convenient, they said, that he died just when the school board was discussing pay raises. How strange that I'd been the one to prepare his meals during his illness. Never mind that I'd nursed him without sleep for 3 days. That I'd begged the doctor to try different treatments. The story was too good. The young widow who'd poisoned her husband for his insurance money. Was there insurance money? Barely enough to bury him. But facts never get in the way of good gossip. She sat back down, met his eyes. I've kept all Jed's papers. Everything he gathered about the missing money. I don't know why. It's not like anyone would believe me if I brought it forward. But throwing it away felt like agreeing he died for nothing. The storm had begun to ease, the rain settling into a steady patter. Jonas realized he'd been sitting in Sarah's kitchen for over an hour, talking more freely than he had in 2 years. Something about her quiet acceptance, her understanding of false accusation, made him feel less alone. Who was it? He asked. Who did your husband confront? Sarah hesitated, then, Pastor Levi Morton? Jonas set down his cup carefully. The same Pastor Morton who leads the church here? The very same. Pillar of the community, voice of moral authority, conductor of the choir that sings my sins every Sunday. Her voice carried a bitter edge. He's careful. I'll give him that. Never directly accuses me of anything. Just mentions in sermons how we must guard against wolves in sheep's clothing. How poison can lurk in the sweetest seeming vessels. The congregation understands his meaning well enough. And no one questions him? Question Pastor Morton, the man who visits the sick, comforts the bereaved, organizes charity drives? He's untouchable. More than that, he's building quite a following. There's talk of him running for territorial office next year. Jonas felt a familiar anger building, the same rage that had consumed him when Wells had walked free while he'd been driven from town. Men like that, they count on good people staying quiet, on their victims being too broken or frightened to fight back. Or too dead, Sarah added quietly. They sat in silence as the storm finally passed, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. The kitchen had grown dim, and Sarah rose to light a lamp. You should know, she said, adjusting the wick, that having you here talking to you like this, it's going to make things worse for me. The gossip's already started. The widow and the drifter, they're calling us. Give it another week and they'll have us engaged in all manner of impropriety. I can leave, find somewhere else. No. The word came out sharp, definitive. I've spent 3 years hiding, keeping quiet, hoping they'd eventually forget and leave me alone. They haven't. They won't. Maybe it's time I stopped caring what they say. She turned to face him, lamplight casting shadows across her face. I'm tired, Mr. Gage. Tired of being afraid. Tired of being ashamed of things I didn't do. If they want to gossip about us, let them. At least I'll have help keeping this place from falling apart while they do it. Jonas stood, suddenly aware of how small the kitchen was, how close they were standing. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. The question is, are you? Staying here, being associated with me, it won't make your life any easier. Pastor Morton doesn't like people who challenge the order of things. And you strike me as someone who's done his share of challenging." Jonas thought of the work still needed on the property, of Sarah's quiet strength in the face of injustice, of the strange peace he'd felt sitting at her table. "I've got nowhere else to be. Might as well be here." It wasn't the most eloquent declaration, but Sarah smiled as if he'd offered her something precious. "Then we have an understanding. You keep my roof from falling in, and I'll keep you fed. Let the town make of that what they will." Jonas gathered the wet towels, preparing to check if the shed had dried out enough to sleep in. At the door, he paused. "Those papers your husband kept. Might I look at them sometime?" Sarah studied him carefully. "Why?" "Old habits. I may not wear a badge anymore, but I still know how to read evidence. Maybe there's something there, some way to..." "To what? Clear my name? Expose Morton?" She shook her head. "That kind of justice doesn't exist in Willow Ridge. Mr. Gage..." "Maybe not. But wouldn't you like to know for certain what your husband found? What he died for?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll think about it. Good night, Mr. Gage. Good night, Mrs. Mackenzie." The shed had indeed dried out, and Jonas settled onto his cot, listening to the last of the storm move east. Through the small window, he could see lamplight still glowing in Sarah's kitchen. He wondered if she was thinking about their conversation, about the papers hidden somewhere in that house, about the dangerous game they were both agreeing to play. In town, in his comfortable study lined with theological books he'd never actually read, Pastor Levi Morton stood at his window, watching the storm clouds retreat. He'd seen Jonas Gage on Sarah's roof, had watched them work together to repair the damage. His hands clenched behind his back, knuckles white with pressure. The widow was becoming a problem again. He'd thought 3 years of isolation would break her, drive her away. Instead, she'd endured, and now she had an ally. Morton knew all about Jonas Gage. He made it his business to know about any strangers who lingered in Willow Ridge. A former lawman, disgraced and cast out. Just the sort of man who might listen to a widow's tales of injustice. Might start asking the wrong questions. Morton returned to his desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write. He had friends too, men who owed him favors, men who understood that sometimes maintaining order required decisive action. The widow and her hired man thought they could weather the storm together. They were about to learn that some storms were crafted by human hands, and those were the ones that destroyed most thoroughly. The garden had become their evening ritual. After supper, while the day's heat still lingered in the air, Jonas would help Sarah tend the vegetables. It was peaceful work, the kind that settled a man's mind after a day of repairs and construction. He'd rebuilt the chicken coop entirely, fixed the loose boards on the porch, and was halfway through replacing the fence posts that had rotted through. This particular evening, Sarah was teaching him to distinguish between weeds and the young carrot shoots. She knelt in the dirt, her work dress protected by a worn apron, pointing out the subtle differences in leaf shape. You see, the carrot leaves are more feathered, delicate. These broader ones are pigweed. They'll choke out everything if you let them. Jonas crouched beside her, studying the plants with the same intensity he'd once reserved for reading sign on a trail. There was something deeply satisfying about this simple knowledge, about learning to nurture rather than hunt. You've got good hands for this work, Sarah observed, watching him carefully extract a weed without disturbing the vegetables. Patient hands. Never thought I'd be farming, Jonas admitted. Always figured I'd wear a badge till they put me in the ground. Life has a way of changing our plans. Sarah moved to the next row, her movements efficient from years of practice. I was going to write books once. Had a whole novel planned out about a school teacher who solved mysteries in her spare time. Why didn't you? In marriage, teaching, life, they have a way of filling up all the spare time. Then after Jed died, she shrugged. Hard to write about solving mysteries when you're living in one. They worked in companionable silence until the light began to fade. Jonas was dumping the pulled weeds in the compost heap when Sarah suddenly spoke. I've been thinking about what you said about Jed's papers. Jonas straightened, giving her his full attention. If you're serious about looking at them, I mean, they're in a strongbox in the attic. I haven't opened it since I put them away 3 years ago. I'm serious. Sarah studied his face in the gathering dusk. It might come to nothing. Or worse, it might stir up trouble we're not prepared for. Trouble's already stirring, Jonas pointed out. Least we could do is understand why. That night, after Sarah had retired, Jonas sat at the kitchen table with the strongbox open before him. Sarah had given him the key with hands that trembled slightly, then left him to his investigation. The box contained a neat stack of papers, all in what must have been Jed Mackenzie's careful handwriting. Jonas lit another lamp and began to read. Jed had been methodical, recording dates, amounts, and discrepancies with the precision of a trained bookkeeper. The church building fund had been established 5 years ago, with donations from most of the town's residents. The goal was to expand the church, add a proper vestry and Sunday school rooms. But while money went in, very little construction had emerged. According to Jed's notes, over $3,000 had been collected, a fortune for a town like Willow Ridge. Yet the only improvements were some paint and new pews that couldn't have cost more than a few hundred. Where had the rest gone? Jed had traced several large withdrawals to construction supplies that were never delivered. Contractor fees for workers who never appeared. Each withdrawal was authorized by Pastor Morton, countersigned by the church treasurer, a nervous little man named Elwyn Moss who'd left town abruptly 2 years ago, claiming his sister in Ohio needed care. But it was the last few pages that made Jonas's blood run cold. Jed had discovered that Morton wasn't just stealing from the church. He was using the money to buy influence. Payments to territorial officials, bribes to ensure favorable treatment for business ventures. Even funds sent to Kansas City newspapers to publish glowing articles about the rising moral leader of the frontier. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Jed's death. Confronted L.M. after service today. Showed him evidence. He claimed misunderstanding. Promised explanation. Meeting scheduled for Thursday evening. S. Worried. But I believe in redemption. Every man deserves chance to make things right. Thursday evening. The church social where Jed had fallen ill. Jonas set down the papers, mind racing. This was more than simple theft. It was a systematic scheme to build political power on a foundation of stolen funds, and Morton had killed to protect it. He was so absorbed in thought that he didn't hear the soft footsteps until Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl. Couldn't sleep, she explained. Found anything? Jonas gestured to the papers. Your husband was a brave man, and a thorough one. This is enough to hang Morton, if we could get anyone to listen. Sarah sat across from him, pulled a page closer. I remember this entry. Jed was so excited when he found it, proof that the lumber order was falsified. He thought it would be enough to force Morton to confess. Instead, Morton forced him to take poison. We can't prove that. No, Jonas agreed. but we might be able to prove the rest. These financial records, does the church still have the originals? Supposedly, though I'd bet they've been altered or destroyed by now. Jonas leaned back, thinking. In his sheriff days, he'd have taken this evidence to a judge, had warrants issued, arrests made, but that system had failed him once already. And in a town where Morton controlled the narrative, official channels were likely compromised. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. "I'm thinking we need to be smart about this. Morton's built himself a nice little kingdom here. He won't give it up easy, and he's already shown he'll kill to protect it. So what do we do? First, we make copies of everything, hide them in different places, then we start gathering allies quietly. There must be others who've noticed things aren't right." Sarah laughed bitterly. "You haven't been here long enough. Morton's got this town locked up tight. Those who might oppose him are too scared, and the rest benefit from his corruption. What about Anders, the blacksmith? He seemed decent. He is, but he's got a family to protect. Same with most folks who might listen. Morton's made sure everyone has something to lose." Jonas gathered the papers, returned them to the strongbox. "Then we wait. We watch. Men like Morton always overreach eventually. When he does, we need to be ready." Sarah took the box, clutched it to her chest. "You're talking about staying long-term. This isn't your fight, Jonas." He met her eyes steadily. "Wasn't your husband's fight either, until it became about right and wrong. I've run from one fight already. Don't intend to run from another." Something shifted in Sarah's expression. "You're a curious man, Jonas Gage. Most would have taken their wages and moved on by now. Why stay?" Jonas considered the question. The safe answer was about justice, about his lawman's instinct to see wrongs righted. But standing in the lamplight kitchen with Sarah, the truth was both simpler and more complex. "Maybe I'm tired of running. Maybe I've found something worth standing still for." The words hung between them, carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Sarah's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. "I should warn you," she said softly. "Getting close to me hasn't worked out well for anyone. I seem to bring misfortune to those who care about, to those around me. I'll take my chances." She stood, still holding the strongbox. "Then I'll say good night, Mr. Gage, and thank you for believing Jed, for believing me." "Jonas," he said. "If we're going to face down the town together, might as well use my given name." "Jonas," she repeated, testing the sound. "Good night, Jonas." After she'd gone, Jonas extinguished the lamps and made his way to the shed. But sleep eluded him. His mind kept turning over the evidence, planning strategies, considering angles of attack. Somewhere in the darkness, a screech owl called, its eerie sound carrying across the night. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Jonas was replacing boards on the back steps when he heard voices from the front of the house. He recognized Sarah's measured tones. Then another voice, male, authoritative, unpleasantly familiar. Pastor Morton." Jonas set down his hammer, moved quietly around the side of the house. Through the morning glory vines, he could see the front porch. Morton stood at the bottom of the steps, dressed in his usual black suit despite the warming day. Two other men flanked him, Otto Bram and Cyrus Teague, both members of the church board and, if Jonas's instincts were right, Morton's enforcers. "Simply concerned about your welfare, Mrs. Mackenzie," Morton was saying, his voice dripping false sympathy. "A woman alone, taking in strangers. People talk." "People always talk," Sarah replied. She stood in her doorway, arms crossed, blocking entrance to her home. "Is there something specific you wanted, Pastor?" I thought perhaps we could pray together, for guidance in these troubled times and for wisdom in our associations. I pray just fine on my own, thank you. Morton's expression hardened slightly. Pride, Mrs. Mackenzie, is a dangerous sin, as is ingratitude. The church has been very patient with you, despite the unfortunate circumstances of your husband's passing. Patient? Sarah's voice sharpened. Is that what you call spreading lies about me from your pulpit? I spread only the word of God. If you hear condemnation in Scripture, perhaps you should examine your conscience. Jonas had heard enough. He stepped around the corner, making his presence known. The three men turned, and Jonas caught the quick flash of anger in Morton's eyes before the pastor smoothed his expression. Mr. Gage, we were just discussing you. So I heard. Jonas climbed the steps, positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of Sarah, a protective stance he adopted without thinking. Something you need? Morton's smile was cold. I was counseling Mrs. Mackenzie on the importance of reputation. A widow must be especially careful. Caesar's wife, you understand? I understand plenty, Jonas said evenly. I also understand that Mrs. Mackenzie has work to do, as do I. Bram stepped forward, fists clenched. You talking back to the pastor drifter? Otto, Morton said mildly, and the larger man stepped back. Mr. Gage is right. We've taken enough of your time, Mrs. Mackenzie. But do think on what I've said. The offer of prayer and guidance remains open. The three men left, but not before Teague made a point of spitting tobacco juice dangerously close to Jonas's boots. Jonas watched them go, noting how people on the street gave them wide berth. They'll be back, Sarah said quietly. Yes? It'll get worse now. Morton doesn't like being challenged. Jonas thought of the papers in the strongbox, of Jed Mackenzie's fatal meeting, of all the ways a determined man could make life unbearable for those who opposed him. Then we'd better be ready, he said. Sarah looked up at him, and for a moment, her careful composure cracked. I'm frightened, she admitted. For the first time since Jed died, I'm truly frightened. Not for myself, but Morton destroys everyone who stands against him. I couldn't bear it if... She stopped herself, but Jonas heard what she hadn't said. He reached out, carefully, and placed his hand over hers where it gripped the doorframe. He won't destroy us, he said quietly. Men like Morton, they're powerful because people believe they are, but shine enough light on them, and they shrivel up like slugs in the sun. We just need to find the right light. Sarah turned her hand palm up, briefly squeezed his fingers before stepping back. I hope you're right, for both our sakes. That evening, Jonas took extra precautions, checking the locks on Sarah's doors, making sure the windows were secure. He moved his cot in the shed to have a clear view of the house and kept his old Colt revolver within easy reach. He'd hoped to avoid violence, but hope was a luxury a practical man couldn't always afford. As darkness fell over Willow Ridge, Jonas thought about the bread that had started all this. One simple act of kindness, reaching across the divide of suspicion and loneliness. Now they were bound together, the widow and the drifter, against forces that had already killed once to keep their secrets. But for the first time in 2 years, Jonas felt something he'd thought lost forever. Purpose. Not just the purpose of survival, of making it through another day, but something larger. Something worth fighting for. In her bedroom. Sarah lay awake thinking similar thoughts. She'd been alone so long, had grown accustomed to the weight of isolation. Now there was someone else to consider, someone else to worry about. It frightened her how quickly Jonas had become essential to her daily life, how his quiet presence had begun to heal wounds she'd thought permanent. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Morton wouldn't rest now that his authority had been questioned. But tonight, knowing Jonas kept watch in the shed. Sarah allowed herself to feel something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. The first warning came 3 days after Morton's visit. Jonas found it nailed to the chicken coop door, a crude drawing of a noose with "Leave Town" scrawled beneath. He pulled it down before Sarah could see. But she noticed the fresh nail hole that evening. "What was it?" she asked, running her fingers over the splintered wood. "Nothing important." She gave him a look that said she wasn't fooled. "Jonas, we agreed to face this together. Don't start protecting me from the truth now." He showed her the crumpled paper. Sarah studied it with the same calm she'd shown Morton, but Jonas saw her hands tremble slightly as she folded it carefully. "We should keep this," she said. "Evidence." "Evidence of what? That someone in town owns a pencil and doesn't like strangers?" "Evidence of escalation. Jed taught me that. Document everything. He used to say, you never know what detail might matter later." The second warning was less subtle. Jonas woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the terrified squealing of horses. The small stable Sarah used for her old mare was ablaze, flames already licking at the roof beams. He grabbed a bucket, shouted for Sarah, and ran toward the fire. By the time Sarah emerged, Jonas had managed to lead the panicked mare to safety. Together they formed a bucket brigade from the well, but it was futile. The stable was old, the wood dry as tinder. Within minutes, the structure collapsed in a shower of sparks. They stood watching the flames, Sarah still in her nightdress and shawl, Jonas shirtless and covered in soot. The mare trembled beside them, eyes rolling white with fear. "At least Buttercup's safe," Sarah said quietly. She stroked the horse's neck, her touch gradually calming the animal. Jonas examined the ground around the burned stable. Even in the flickering light, he could see the dark stains where kerosene had been splashed, the clear boot prints in the dirt. This was no accident. "We should report this to—" He stopped. Report it to whom? The sheriff was Morton's cousin. The mayor attended Morton's church. The judge. To no one. Sarah finished. "I know. Jed tried that route. They'll say I must have knocked over a lantern even though I haven't been in the stable since yesterday morning." Neighbors began arriving, drawn by the smoke and commotion. Most stood at a distance, whispering among themselves. Only Anders the blacksmith came forward to help, bringing more buckets and a horse blanket for Buttercup. "Bad business," Anders said quietly to Jonas while Sarah talked to Mrs. Patterson, who'd come to gawk rather than help. "This kind of thing didn't used to happen in Willow Ridge." "When did it start?" Jonas asked. Anders glanced around, lowered his voice further. "About 5 years back, right around when Morton started talking about moral improvement and community standards. Funny how improving morals seems to require so much threatening and burning." Before Jonas could respond, Anders moved away, but he'd said enough. 5 years, just when the church building fund had started, when Morton had begun his rise to power. By dawn, the stable was nothing but smoking rubble. Sarah stood surveying the damage, her face composed but pale. Jonas had found a shirt and was picking through the debris, looking for anything salvageable. "I'll rebuild it," he said. "Stronger this time, maybe with a proper stone foundation so they can't burn it again?" Sarah's voice was bitter. "What's the point, Jonas? They'll just find something else to destroy. The chicken coop, the house itself. We can't guard everything." Jonas straightened, crossed to where she stood. "You're right. Defense isn't enough. We need to take the fight to them." "How? Morton owns this town." "Does he? Or does he just own the fear?" Jonas gestured toward the street where neighbors still lingered, pretending to go about their morning business while watching the drama unfold. "Look at them. They're not happy about this. They're scared. But they're not happy. Sarah followed his gaze. Mrs. Olson from 2 houses down quickly averted her eyes. Young Tom Bradley, who worked at the general store, looked genuinely distressed. Even Mrs. Patterson seemed subdued, her usual gossipy excitement replaced by something like worry. "He fears a powerful chain," Sarah said, "but it can be broken. We just need the right moment." That moment came sooner than expected. 3 nights later. Jonas was keeping watch from the shed he'd taken to sleeping in shifts, always alert for trouble, when he heard voices from the street. He crept closer, staying in the shadows. Otto Bram and Cyrus Teague stood by Sarah's gate, and they weren't alone. 3 other men Jonas didn't recognize were with them, passing a bottle between them. Dutch courage for whatever they'd planned. "Just scare her good," Bram was saying. "Pastor says she needs a stronger reminder about proper behavior." "What about the drifter?" one of the strangers asked. "Him too. But Morton wants the woman terrified. Says she's got something that belongs to the church, some papers her husband stole." Jonas's blood chilled. Morton knew about Jed's evidence somehow. He'd found out. Teague took a long pull from the bottle. "Don't see why we don't just burn the whole place. Be done with both of them." "Because," Bram said with exaggerated patience, "the pastor wants it to look natural, like she finally cracked from guilt and ran off. Can't have that if she's burned up in her bed. So we go in, rough them up some, take whatever papers we find." "That's the plan. Pastor says check the attic especially, and that old desk in the parlor." Jonas had heard enough. He slipped back through the darkness, entered Sarah's house through the back door he'd left unlocked for just such an emergency. He found her in the kitchen, unable to sleep, grading papers by lamplight. "Get dressed," he whispered urgently. "Riding clothes, we're leaving." To her credit, Sarah didn't argue or ask questions. She disappeared upstairs, returned minutes later in a dark split skirt and jacket. Jonas had already retrieved the strongbox from its new hiding place, beneath loose floorboards in the pantry. Not the attic where Morton expected it. 5 men, he explained quickly. "Coming to tear the place apart looking for Jed's papers. We need to go now." Sarah grabbed her teaching satchel, stuffed in some clothes and personal items. "Where?" "The old mine shaft past the quarry. I scouted it last week. It's stable, hidden. We'll hide there tonight. Figure out our next move come morning." They slipped out the back as the men approached the front. Jonas had saddled Buttercup earlier, a precaution that now proved wise. Sarah rode while Jonas led the horse, keeping to the shadows. Moving with the silence he'd learned tracking outlaws in his sheriff days. Behind them, they heard the crash of breaking glass, angry shouts when the men found the house empty. But by then, Jonas and Sarah were beyond the town limits, heading into the Badlands where pursuit would be difficult in darkness. The mine shaft was as Jonas remembered, a horizontal cut into the hillside, shored up with old timbers but solid. He'd stashed supplies here earlier in the week, blankets, water, some food. Another precaution born of experience. Sarah sat on a crate, holding the strongbox like a lifeline. In the light of their single lantern, she looked older, worn down by the constant fear and harassment. "This is what Jed must have felt," she said quietly. "The night before he died, knowing they were closing in, that his time was running out. Except Jed was alone," Jonas pointed out. "You're not." She looked up at him then, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what they'd both been dancing around for weeks. Jonas cleared his throat, looked away first. "We can't stay here long," he said. "Come morning. They'll search the whole area, but I've been thinking." "Yes? What if we didn't run? What if we took this evidence somewhere it couldn't be ignored?" "Where?" Morton has influence all the way to the territorial capital. Not everywhere. There's a federal marshal in Cedar Falls, about 3 days' ride north, Samuel Carson. I knew him back when I wore a badge. He's honest as they come. Answers to Washington, not local politics. Sarah considered this. 3 days through open country, they'll catch us on the road. Not if we're smart about it, not if we have help. Help from whom? Jonas smiled grimly. You saw the neighbors' faces after the fire. Not everyone in Willow Ridge loves Morton. Some are just waiting for someone else to make the first move. And you think they'll risk themselves for us? Not for us, for themselves, for their own freedom from Morton's stranglehold. Jonas pulled out a piece of paper, began sketching a map. Here's what I'm thinking. They talked through the night, planning, arguing, refining. By dawn, they had a strategy that just might work. But it would require courage from people who'd shown little so far, and luck in quantities Jonas had never possessed. As the first light crept into the mine shaft, Sarah repacked the strongbox, her movements decisive. Whatever happens, she said, I want you to know something. That first day when I left the bread, I didn't do it out of pity. I did it because I saw something in you, a kindness despite the hardness. These weeks since, you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? The belief that justice might still exist, that truth might still matter. She stood, faced him squarely. I know you didn't ask for this fight, but I'm glad you're here for it. Jonas wanted to tell her then, about how she'd saved him too, how her quiet strength had reminded him why he'd once believed in law and order, why protecting the innocent was worth any sacrifice. But words had never been his strong suit, and the moment passed. Instead, he said, we should move. They'll search the quarry first, then spread out. There's another hiding spot about a mile east, a grove of cottonwoods by the creek. We can watch the roads from there, see what Morton does next. As they prepared to leave their temporary shelter, Jonas checked his revolver, made sure Sarah had the small Derringer he'd given her tucked in her jacket pocket. He hoped they wouldn't need weapons. But hope, as he'd reflected before, was a luxury they couldn't afford. The sun was fully up as they emerged from the mine, casting long shadows across the broken landscape. In the distance, they could see dust clouds, riders spreading out from town, searching. Ready? Jonas asked. Sarah adjusted her grip on the strongbox, lifted her chin with the same determination he'd seen that first day on her porch. Ready? They mounted Buttercup together. Sarah in front, Jonas behind, the strongbox secured between them. As they rode toward the cottonwoods, Jonas allowed himself one glance back at Willow Ridge, sleeping in the morning light, somewhere in that town. Pastor Morton was discovering his men had failed, that his prey had escaped with the very evidence he'd killed to suppress. The fight was far from over. It had barely begun. But for the first time since he'd fled Colorado, Jonas felt like he was moving towards something instead of away. And if that something included the remarkable woman riding with him, her back straight despite exhaustion, her spirit unbroken despite years of torment, well, that was a truth he'd examine when they weren't running for their lives. The cottonwoods beckoned, promising temporary shelter. Beyond them lay the road to Cedar Falls and perhaps, finally, justice. Jonas tightened his arms around Sarah, felt her lean back slightly into his protection, and urged Buttercup into the shadows of the trees. The cottonwood grove provided good cover, but Jonas knew they couldn't linger. Through the leaves, he watched the dust clouds multiply as more riders joined the search. Morton had mobilized half the town, it seemed. They're spreading west, Sarah observed, shading her eyes against the morning sun. Away from Cedar Falls. Morton's assuming we'd run for Kansas. Maybe Denver. Big cities where strangers can disappear. Jonas adjusted his field glasses, one of the few possessions he'd kept from his sheriff days. He's not thinking like a lawman. He's thinking like a man used to people running scared. They waited until the searchers had moved beyond the nearest ridge, then emerged from the trees. Jonas had plotted a route that would keep them off the main roads, following creek beds and game trails he'd scouted during his weeks in Willow Ridge. By midday, they'd covered perhaps 10 miles, Buttercup maintaining a steady pace despite carrying 2 riders. They stopped to rest in a dry wash, sharing water and the hard biscuits Jonas had stashed in his emergency supplies. "Someone's coming," Sarah said suddenly, tilting her head to listen. Jonas heard it too. Hoofbeats, moving fast but not directly toward them. He helped Sarah dismount, led Buttercup deeper into the wash where overhanging banks would hide them. They crouched in the shadows, waiting. A lone rider appeared on the ridge above, and Jonas recognized the massive frame immediately. Anders, the blacksmith, on his draft horse. The man was alone, scanning the landscape with obvious purpose. Jonas made a decision. He stepped into view, hand near his revolver but not touching it. Anders spotted him immediately, raised one hand in greeting, and guided his horse down into the wash. "He figured you might come this way," Anders said without preamble. "You always studied the land real careful when you were in town. Why are you here?" Sarah emerged from hiding, suspicious but hopeful. Anders dismounted, pulled a canvas sack from his saddlebags. Supplies, food, ammunition, bit of money folks scraped together. Not everyone in Willow Ridge agrees with what Morton's doing. "Folks?" Jonas accepted the sack, felt its weight. Me, Tom Bradley from the store, the widow Chen who runs the laundry, few others. We've been talking quiet-like, about how things have gotten worse since Morton took charge, about how maybe it's time someone stood up to him. Sarah stepped forward. "And you're willing to risk—" "My family, my livelihood." Anders smiled grimly. "Ma'am, Morton's already taking both, just slower. New charity tax every month, mandatory contributions to his building fund. Pretty soon won't be nothing left to lose." Jonas examined the supplies, enough to get them to Cedar Falls comfortably. "This is more than generous. But we need something else. Name it." "A distraction. Something to pull Morton's men back to town. Give us clear running to Cedar Falls." Anders considered. "There's a town meeting tonight. Morton called it to discuss the criminal elements threatening our community. Means you two, of course." "Perfect," Jonas said. "What if during that meeting someone discovered something that needed immediate attention, say, a fire at the church?" "You want me to burn the church?" Anders looked shocked. "No, just make it look like someone tried to smoke, commotion, get everyone running to save their precious building. While they're busy, we'll be putting miles between us and them." Anders nodded slowly. "Could work, Mrs. Chen's grandson. Billy, he's clever with such things. Knows how to make lots of smoke without real damage." They refined the plan quickly. Anders would return to town, spread word among their small group of allies. Come evening, just as the town meeting reached full swing, smoke would pour from the church basement. In the chaos, Jonas and Sarah would have their best chance to reach Cedar Falls undetected. "One more thing," Anders said as he prepared to leave. "Morton's been asking about your past. Gage. Sent telegrams to Colorado, other places. Don't know what he's learned, but he was mighty pleased this morning. Watch yourself." After Anders left, Jonas and Sarah continued their careful journey north. They spoke little, both aware that their situation had shifted. It was no longer just about them. Others were risking themselves for the cause. "I never wanted this," Sarah said as they watered Buttercup at a small spring. "People putting themselves in danger because of me." "It's not because of you," Jonas corrected. "It's because of what Morton represents. You're just the catalyst. This has been building for years." They found shelter for the afternoon in an abandoned line shack, probably used by cowboys during cattle drives. Jonas checked the perimeter while Sarah organized their supplies, including what Anders had brought. $40, she counted. "That's more than most families see in a month. And look, Mrs. Chen included some of her dumplings." The normalcy of her tone, discussing food while they fled for their lives, struck Jonas as both absurd and deeply moving. This was who Sarah was, practical in the face of chaos, finding grace notes in desperate situations. As evening approached, they positioned themselves on a low hill overlooking the road to Cedar Falls. In the distance, they could see the smudge that was Willow Ridge. Jonas checked his pocket watch. Nearly time for the town meeting. "There," Sarah pointed. A column of smoke rose from the town, thicker and blacker than any chimney would produce. Even from this distance, they could imagine the bells ringing, people running, Morton's rage at the disruption. "Now," Jonas said. They rode hard for the first hour, taking advantage of the remaining daylight and the distraction Anders had provided. Buttercup, despite her age, seemed to understand the urgency, maintaining a steady canter that ate up the miles. As full darkness fell, they slowed to a walk, trusting Jonas's memory of the terrain. The moon was rising, nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by. They'd made good progress. Jonas estimated they'd covered half the distance to Cedar Falls. "We'll need to rest soon," he said. "Buttercup can't keep this pace all night." "There's a stage station about 5 miles ahead." Sarah remembered. "Paulson's Creek. Jed and I stayed there once." Too risky. Morton will have sent word ahead to watch for us." "Then where?" Jonas had been dreading this part. "There's a place, but you won't like it." An hour later, they stood outside a weathered cabin tucked into a canyon. Lamplight glowed in the windows, and the sound of fiddle music drifted through the night air. A painted sign above the door read Lucky Dollar Saloon, though it was clearly more than just a drinking establishment. "A brothel," Sarah's voice was carefully neutral. "Martha Washington runs a clean place," Jonas said defensively. "And she has no love for Morton. He's been trying to shut her down for years. She'll help us." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened. A woman emerged, perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and a face that had seen everything twice. She wore a respectable business dress that wouldn't have looked out of place in any merchant's shop. "Jonas Gage," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Heard you were stirring up trouble in Willow Ridge. About time someone did. Martha, we need—" "I know what you need. Gossip travels faster than horses out here." She turned to Sarah, gave her an appraising look. "You'd be the school teacher, the one they say poisoned her husband." Sarah stiffened. "I didn't." "Of course you didn't. Any fool could see that. Morton, though, now there's a man with poison in his soul." Martha stepped aside, gestured them in. "Come on. You can rest here tonight. I've got a room in the back, away from the business." The interior was surprisingly tasteful. Clean floors, decent furniture, paintings that were artistic rather than lewd. Several young women in evening dress looked up from their card game, curious but not unfriendly. Martha led them through the main room to a private quarters in the rear. "You can stay here. I'll have food brought and water for washing. Your horse will be cared for. We can pay—" Jonas started, but Martha waved him off. "Your money's no good here. Though if you're successful with that federal marshal and Morton gets what's coming to him, that'll be payment enough." As Martha turned to go, Sarah spoke up. "Why help us? You don't know us?" Martha paused at the door. "I know Morton, know what he did to one of my girls who tried to leave this life, start fresh, destroyed her reputation, hounded her until she took her own life. Man like that hiding behind a pastor's collar, that's blasphemy worse than anything that happens in my establishment." After she left, Jonas and Sarah were alone in the small but clean room. Sarah sat on the bed, still holding the strongbox, looking lost. "I'm sorry," Jonas said. "I know this isn't proper. But Martha's right, this is the last place Morton's men would look for you." "For us," Sarah corrected. "And I'm not as shocked as you think. Jed and we believed in treating everyone with dignity. These women, they're just trying to survive, same as anyone." A knock interrupted them. One of the young women entered with a tray of food, stew, bread, even a small pie. "Miss Martha says to eat up," she said shyly. "And there's hot water coming for baths if you want." After they'd eaten, Sarah surprised Jonas by accepting the offer of a bath. While she was gone, he studied their situation. They'd made good progress, but tomorrow would be the real test. The final push to Cedar Falls, where Marshal Carson might or might not be willing to help. Sarah returned, her hair damp, wearing a borrowed dress while hers was being cleaned. She looked younger, more vulnerable, but also somehow stronger. "Your turn," she said. "I'll guard the evidence." When Jonas returned, cleaner than he'd been in weeks, he found Sarah had opened the strongbox and spread Jed's papers on the bed. She was adding new documents, her own notes about the harassment, the fire, the attack on her home. "Building the case," she explained. "Jed would want it to be complete." They worked together, organizing evidence, preparing their presentation for the marshal. It was near midnight when they finished. Sarah began gathering the papers, then paused. "Jonas, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something." He waited, seeing her struggle for words. "When Jed died, I thought my life was over, not just because I loved him, but because he was my partner in everything. I couldn't imagine facing the world alone." She looked up, met his eyes. "These past weeks, working with you, fighting alongside you, I don't feel alone anymore." Jonas felt his chest tighten. "Sarah, I know we haven't talked about what comes after, if there is an after, but I wanted you to know, while I have the courage to say it." He crossed to her, took her hands in his. They were ink-stained from writing, calloused from work, beautiful in their capability. "There will be an after," he said firmly. "And when this is over, when Morton's facing justice and you're free to live without fear, then we'll talk about what comes next. I promise you that." She squeezed his hands, then let go and began packing away the papers. The moment passed, but something had been acknowledged between them, something that would wait for a better time. They slept in shifts, taking turns watching even in this safe haven. Old habits died hard, and trust came slowly to those who'd been betrayed before. Dawn found them on the road again, Buttercup refreshed and Martha Washington waving them off with a packed lunch and her best wishes. "You give that marshal hell," she called. "And if he doesn't listen, you come back here. We'll figure out another way." The final stretch to Cedar Falls lay ahead. Jonas could see storm clouds building on the horizon, fitting, he thought, for what was to come. Beside him, Sarah rode tall, the strongbox secured in her saddlebags, her face set with determination. They'd come too far to fail now. Whatever waited in Cedar Falls, justice or disappointment, triumph or tragedy, they'd face it together. And that, Jonas realized, made all the difference. The road stretched out before them, dusty and uncertain. Behind them, Willow Ridge would be waking to the aftermath of last night's chaos. Morton surely rage at their escape. But for now, in this moment, it was just the two of them against the world, and somehow, that felt like enough. Cedar Falls sprawled before them in the afternoon sun, a proper town with brick buildings, paved main streets, and the bustle of commerce. After the dusty isolation of Willow Ridge, it seemed almost overwhelming. Jonas guided Buttercup toward the Federal Building, a solid two-story structure with an American flag snapping in the breeze. "You remember this Marshall Carson?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying the nervousness she'd hidden during their journey. "Sam's a good man, or was 5 years ago, and things change." Jonas dismounted, helped Sarah down. "But if anyone will give us a fair hearing, it's him." The Federal Building's interior was cool and official, all dark wood and serious portraits of government men. A clerk looked up from his desk, took in their trail-worn appearance with obvious disapproval. "Marshall Carson, please," Jonas said. "Tell him Jonas Gage is here." The clerk's expression shifted slightly. Recognition? Wariness? He disappeared through a door, returned moments later. "The marshal will see you." Samuel Carson hadn't changed much. Still lean, still sharp-eyed, still wearing his badge like it meant something. He rose from behind his desk, studied Jonas for a long moment. "Jonas, heard you'd had some trouble in Colorado." "That's one way to put it." Carson's gaze shifted to Sarah, and his expression softened slightly. "Ma'am, please, both of you, sit. Henry, bring coffee." When they were settled, Carson leaned back, fingers steepled. "I got a wire this morning from a Pastor Morton in Willow Ridge. Says you kidnapped a widow, stole church property, burned down a stable, claims you're wanted in Colorado for taking bribes." Jonas felt Sarah tense beside him. "And you believe him?" "I believe Jonas Gage was the most honest lawman I ever worked with. I also believe someone went to considerable trouble to destroy your reputation." Carson's eyes narrowed. "Question is, why are you here?" Sarah spoke for the first time. "Because my husband was murdered for trying to expose Morton's crimes, and Mr. Gage has been helping me seek justice. Over the next hour, they laid out everything: Jed's investigation, his death, the years of harassment, Morton's theft and growing power." Sarah produced the documents, spreading them across Carson's desk with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Carson examined each paper carefully, asking pointed questions, making notes. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor before he finally looked up. "This is substantial. More than enough for a federal investigation." He paused. "But you need to understand something. Morton's not just some small-town preacher anymore. He's got political connections, financial backing. Going after him won't be simple." "We're not asking for simple," Jonas said, "on just justice." Carson stood, paced to the window. "There's something else. That wire about you being wanted in Colorado? I checked. There's no warrant, no official charges, but there are suggestions, rumors, the kind that make lawmen hesitant to trust you." "Sam, I'm not saying I believe them." Carson turned back. "But others might. If we're doing this, we need to be smarter than Morton. Legal, proper, unimpeachable." Sarah leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" "First, sworn statements. Everything you've told me on the record. Then I'll need to verify what I can independently, the financial records especially. If Morton's been moving money across territorial lines, that's federal jurisdiction." "How long will that take?" Jonas asked. "A few days, maybe a week. You'll need to stay in Cedar Falls, and can you afford it? Sarah started to speak, but Carson raised a hand. Never mind. You'll stay at my place. My wife would skin me alive if I let you pay for lodging after what you've been through. The relief on Sarah's face was profound. Jonas felt it too, the first real hope that justice might actually be possible. There's one more thing, Carson said, and if I open this investigation, Morton will know. He'll fight back, use every tool at his disposal. Are you prepared for that? Sarah and Jonas exchanged glances. We've come this far, Sarah said simply. The next days passed in a blur of legal procedures. Carson brought in a territorial prosecutor, then a federal judge who happened to be passing through. Each time they told their story, it grew more polished, more damning. The evidence was cataloged, verified, cross-referenced. Jonas watched Sarah through it all, amazed at her stamina. She answered the same questions dozens of times without complaint, provided details that clearly pained her to recall, maintained her composure even when describing finding her husband's body. On the fourth day, Carson called them into his office. His expression was grim. We've got a problem. Morton's here. Jonas instinctively moved closer to Sarah. Here, in Cedar Falls? Arrived this morning with a lawyer from Kansas City. They're claiming the documents are forgeries, that Mrs. Mackenzie created them to cover her own embezzlement from the school funds. They're demanding her arrest. Sarah went pale. That's absurd. I never touched... I know. Carson's voice was steady. But they've brought their own evidence. Doctored, I'm sure, but it'll take time to prove that. In the meantime... He hesitated. Judge Whitman wants to hear both sides. Tomorrow. Open court. A trap, Jonas said flatly. Morton's trying to turn this around, make Sarah the criminal. Maybe, but Whitman's fair, if we present our case well. Carson trailed off, then squared his shoulders. We'll need to prepare. Mrs. Mackenzie, I'll need you to go through every financial transaction you've handled for the school. Every penny accounted for. That night, in the Carson home. Sarah finally broke. Jonas found her in the garden, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He sat beside her on the bench, uncertain whether to offer comfort or space. I can't do this again, she whispered. Being accused, having to defend myself against lies. It's Jed's death all over again. No, Jonas said firmly. It's not. You're not alone this time. And Morton's not operating in shadows anymore. He's in the open, where law actually means something. Sarah looked up at him, eyes red-rimmed. What if the judge believes him? What if all this was for nothing? Jonas took her hands. Then we'll keep fighting. Appeal to higher courts. Take it to Washington if we have to. But Sarah, I don't think it'll come to that. Morton's desperate, making mistakes. Coming here, confronting us directly? That's not the move of a man who's confident in his position. You really believe that? I do. He squeezed her hands gently. And tomorrow, when you walk into that courtroom, you hold your head high. You're not the criminal here. You're a woman seeking justice for her murdered husband. Don't let Morton or anyone else make you forget that. Sarah managed a weak smile. Jed would have liked you. You have the same stubborn faith in justice. Maybe that's why you trusted me, Jonas suggested, or saw something familiar. Maybe. She stood, composed herself. I should review those school records again. Make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Sarah, Jonas rose too, caught her arm gently. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know I'm proud to stand with you, proud to know you. She looked at him for a long moment, then rose on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek. Thank you, Jonah, for everything. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Word had spread. The mysterious widow, the dismissed lawman, the powerful pastor, all converging in a legal drama that had the town enthralled. Jonas recognized several faces from Willow Ridge, including Anders, who gave him a subtle nod. Morton sat at the plaintiff's table, resplendent in his best suit, his lawyer beside him. He looked confident, even serene, like a man certain of victory. But Jonas noticed the way his fingers drummed against the table, the frequent glances toward the door. Judge Ada Whitman entered, younger than Jonas had expected, with intelligent eyes and an air of no-nonsense competence. She surveyed the packed courtroom with mild displeasure. "This is a preliminary hearing, not a circus," she announced. "I'll have order or I'll clear the room." The crowd settled. The judge continued. "We're here to examine accusations and counter-accusations regarding financial improprieties in Willow Ridge. Mr. Morton, as the plaintiff, you'll present first." Morton's lawyer, a slick man named Pemberton, rose and began painting a picture of Sarah as a desperate woman who'd used her position to embezzle funds, then murdered her husband when he discovered her crimes. The forged documents were her attempt to deflect blame onto the respected pastor. "We have sworn statements," Pemberton declared, producing papers, "from multiple citizens of Willow Ridge attesting to Mrs. Mackenzie's suspicious behavior, her secretive nature, her manipulation of her late husband." Jonas recognized the names on the statements, all Morton's creatures, men who owed him money or favors. But to someone who didn't know the dynamics of Willow Ridge, it might seem compelling. Then it was their turn. The territorial prosecutor, a young man named David Hartley, whom Carson had brought in, rose nervously. But as he began presenting Jed's evidence, his voice grew stronger. The financial records, the pattern of embezzlement, the clear trail leading to Morton. Sarah took the stand, answering questions with quiet dignity. She produced her own records, meticulously kept accounts of every school transaction. Jonas watched the judge's expression shift as the evidence mounted. But it was the final witness who turned the tide. Carson called Martha Washington. Morton visibly started as the brothel owner entered, dressed conservatively but unmistakably herself. Pemberton objected strenuously to a woman of ill repute testifying, but Judge Whitman overruled him. "Miss Washington," Carson began, "you operate an establishment in the vicinity of Willow Ridge." "I do. The Lucky Dollar Saloon." "Are you acquainted with Pastor Morton?" Martha's smile was sharp. "Oh yes, he's tried to shut me down numerous times. Called me a blight on the moral landscape." "And did you have any other dealings with him?" "I did. 3 years ago. He approached me with a business proposition. Wanted to be a silent partner in my establishment. Take half the profits in exchange for stopping his moral crusades against us." The courtroom erupted. Morton shot to his feet, face purple. "Lies! This woman is—" "Sit down, Mr. Morton," Judge Whitman commanded. "So I continue. Miss Washington." "I refused, of course. Don't need partners, silent or otherwise. But I kept his letter making the offer. Seemed prudent." Martha produced a paper from her bag. His handwriting, his signature, offering to invest church funds in my enterprise for a substantial return. Jonas watched Morton crumble as the letter was authenticated. The man who'd built his power on moral authority exposed as a hypocrite willing to profit from the very sins he publicly condemned. Judge Whitman retired to chambers to consider. The wait was agony, but when she returned, her decision was swift. "I find sufficient evidence to warrant a full federal investigation into Pastor Levi Morton's financial dealings. Mr. Morton, you are hereby ordered to surrender all church financial records to Marshal Carson. You are not to leave the territory pending investigation." She turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mackenzie, the accusations against you appear to be entirely without merit. You're free to go." But Morton wasn't finished. As the courtroom began to clear, he pushed past his lawyer, pointed at Sarah with a shaking finger. "You think you've won? You've destroyed a man of God, you and your hired gun." His voice rose to a shout. "Your husband was a meddling fool who couldn't leave well enough alone. He got what he deserved, and you—" He stopped, realizing what he'd said. The courtroom had gone silent. Judge Whitman's voice was cold. "Mr. Morton, did you just confess to murder?" Morton's lawyer grabbed his arm, whispered urgently. But the damage was done. Carson stepped forward, hand on his weapon. "Levi Morton, you're under arrest for the murder of Jed McKenzie." The next moments were chaos. Morton tried to run, but Anders and Tom Bradley blocked his path. Carson had him in irons before he could take 3 steps. As they led him out, Morton's careful dignity completely shattered. He screamed curses at Sarah, at Jonas, at the world that had finally seen through his facade. Sarah stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Jonas moved to her side, offered his arm. She took it, leaning heavily against him as they left the courtroom. Outside, in the clean air of Cedar Falls, Sarah finally spoke. "It's over. It's really over." "The legal part, yes." Jonas agreed. "Morton will hang for murder, spend the rest of his life in prison for the theft. Your name is cleared." But Jonas looked down at her, this remarkable woman who'd endured so much. "But now you have to decide what comes next. Go back to Willow Ridge? Start fresh somewhere else?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I suppose that depends." "On what?" "On whether a certain former lawman has any plans of his own." Jonas felt his heart skip. "I might have a few ideas. You care to share them?" He turned to face her fully, took both her hands in his. Around them, Cedar Falls went about its business. But for Jonas, the world had narrowed to just this moment, this woman. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that a man who's found something worth protecting might want to make that arrangement permanent. If the lady was agreeable." Sarah's smile was radiant through her tears. "The lady might be very agreeable to such an arrangement." Behind them, Carson cleared his throat. "If you two are done making plans, there's still paperwork to complete, and Mrs. Carson insists you stay for a proper celebration dinner." As they walked back to the Federal Building, Sarah's hand in his, Jonas marveled at the turns life could take. He'd arrived in Willow Ridge a broken man, running from false accusations, believing justice was dead. He'd found instead a woman of extraordinary courage, a cause worth fighting for, and a future he'd never dared imagine. The bread on the porch rail had been the beginning. Tomorrow, they'd return to Willow Ridge to collect Sarah's belongings, settle affairs, say goodbye to the few true friends they'd found there. After that, "Jonas?" Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts. "What are you thinking?" Just wondering what name you'll want on the schoolhouse when you start teaching again." She squeezed his hand. "I rather like the sound of Sarah Gage, don't you?" He did. Very much indeed. The return to Willow Ridge felt like entering a different world. News had traveled faster than their horses. Morton's arrest, his confession, the vindication of Sarah McKenzie. As Jonas and Sarah rode down Main Street, accompanied by Marshal Carson and 2 federal deputies, curtains twitched and doors opened. But instead of the hostile stares they'd grown accustomed to, they saw something else. Shame. "Mrs. Patterson stood on her porch, clutching her shawl. As Sarah passed, the older woman stepped forward hesitantly. "Mrs. McKenzie, I owe you an apology, when we all do." Sarah reined in Buttercup, looked down at the woman who'd spread such vicious gossip. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. But apologies won't bring back 3 years of my life, or my husband." They rode on, leaving Mrs. Patterson weeping on her porch. Jonas felt no sympathy for her. She'd been among the cruelest of Sarah's tormentors. At the Blue House, Anders was waiting with several others, Tom Bradley, Mrs. Chen, and surprisingly, Doc Harrington, who'd declared Jed's death natural causes 3 years ago. "Sarah," the doctor began, his aged face drawn with regret. "I need to tell you something. Morton, he threatened my grandson, said if I didn't rule Jed's death as food poisoning, the boy would have an accident. I was a coward. I'm sorry." Sarah dismounted slowly, faced the small crowd. "You all knew. Maybe not the details, but you knew something was wrong, and you chose silence." "We were afraid," Tom Bradley said quietly. "Morton had us all under his thumb, but that's no excuse. We failed you, and we failed Jed." Marshal Carson stepped forward. "Mrs. Mackenzie needs to collect her belongings. I'd appreciate if you'd give her space to do so." The crowd dispersed, but Anders lingered. "For what it's worth," he said to Jonas, "I'm glad you came to town. Glad someone finally had the courage we lacked." Inside the house, Sarah moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching furniture, straightening pictures. Jonas helped her pack, understanding her need to say goodbye properly this time. "I thought I'd feel triumphant," she said, folding linens into a trunk. "But I just feel empty. All those years of fear and isolation, and for what? Morton's greed?" "For power," Jonas corrected. "Men like Morton don't just want money, they want control over thoughts, beliefs, lives." They worked in silence until Sarah reached the bedroom she'd shared with Jed. On the dresser sat a photograph, their wedding portrait. She picked it up with trembling hands. "I can finally tell him it's over," she whispered, "that his death meant something." Jonas stood back, giving her this private moment. When she finally turned, her eyes were wet but peaceful. "I'm ready," she said simply. That evening, the town council, what remained of it after Morton's associates fled, held an emergency meeting. They needed to address the chaos Morton had left behind: missing funds, corrupted records, a church without leadership. To everyone's surprise, Sarah attended. "I have something to say," she announced, standing before the assembled townspeople. The room fell silent. "For 3 years, you believed the worst of me. You whispered behind my back, crossed streets to avoid me, made my life a daily torment. Some of you," she looked directly at several faces, "participated actively in Morton's persecution." Uncomfortable shifting filled the room. "But I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because Willow Ridge is still my home. Was my home, and despite everything, I believe this town can be better than what Morton made it." She pulled out a paper. "This is a full accounting of the embezzled church funds, as best as can be reconstructed. Nearly $4,000 stolen from this community. That money was meant for improvements, for charity, for the common good. It's gone," someone called out. "Morton spent it all on his political ambitions." "Not all," Sarah continued. "Marshal Carson has frozen several accounts. Perhaps 2,000 can be recovered. I propose that money go toward what it was intended, building a proper school, one that welcomes all children, regardless of their parents' standing or beliefs." The room buzzed with discussion. Finally, old Mr. Garrett, who ran the bank, stood. "Who would run such a school? You, Mrs. Mackenzie?" Sarah shook her head. "No. My time in Willow Ridge is done. But there are good teachers who would come if the town showed it had truly changed." "And how do we prove that?" Mrs. Olson asked. Jonas stepped forward. "By acknowledging what happened here, by admitting that fear and prejudice allowed a corrupt man to flourish, by promising to never let it happen again." The meeting continued late into the night, with heated debates and gradual consensus. By the end, the town had voted to use the recovered funds for the school, to install new leadership untainted by Morton's influence, and to formally apologize to Sarah in the town records. It was a start. The next morning, Jonas and Sarah prepared for their final departure. Their belongings were loaded onto a wagon Anders had provided, Buttercup tied behind. As they made final checks, a stream of visitors arrived. Mrs. Chen brought traveling food and a beautiful embroidered shawl. "For your wedding?" she said shyly. "When you have it." Tom Bradley offered a new ledger. "Thought you might want to teach again wherever you settle. This is fresh. No bad memories attached." Even Mrs. Patterson came carrying a quilt. "I made this for my daughter," she said, eyes downcast. "But she won't speak to me, not after how I treated you. Maybe you can use it." Sarah accepted each gift graciously, though Jonas could see the strain it put on her. These people had stood by while she suffered. Their guilt offerings couldn't erase that. As they prepared to leave, Doc Harrington approached Jonas privately. "That medicine I gave Jed during his illness, I've thought about it every day since. If I'd been braver, stood up to Morton." "What's done is done," Jonas said, though not unkindly. "Learn from it." I will." The old doctor straightened. "Where will you go?" "Colorado first. I need to clear my name properly, now that Morton's lies are exposed. After that—" Jonas glanced at Sarah, who was saying goodbye to her garden. "Wherever she wants. Maybe California. Somewhere we can start fresh." They left at noon, the sun high and bright. A small crowd gathered to see them off, some genuinely sorry, others merely curious about the woman who'd brought down the powerful Pastor Morton. As they drove away, Sarah didn't look back. But Jonas did, seeing the town already beginning to reshape itself. For better or worse, change would come slowly. But it would come. They camped that night by a stream, the same one where Jonas had cleaned himself before entering Hartley's store all those weeks ago. So much had changed since then. "Any regrets?" he asked as they sat by their fire. Sarah considered. "About leaving? No. That house stopped being home when Jed died. But I regret the wasted years, the bitterness, the way fear made me small." "You were never small. You survived." "Survival isn't living, Jonas. I see that now." She moved closer to him on the log they shared. These past weeks, fighting back, standing up for truth, that was living, and having someone beside me who believed. She trailed off. "Sarah," Jonas took her hand. "In Cedar Falls, we talked about the future, about names and plans. I meant every word." "I know," she smiled, "but I've been thinking, and before we make new plans, you need to settle your past. Colorado, your reputation, that has to come first." Jonas started to protest, but she placed a finger on his lips. "I've learned what it costs to live under false accusations. I won't have you carry that burden into our life together. We'll go to Colorado, face whatever needs facing. Then, when you're truly free, ask me again." It was wisdom, hard-earned and generous. Jonas brought her hand to his lips, kissed it gently. "You're a remarkable woman. Sarah Ellen Mackenzie. Not so remarkable, just educated by hard experience." She leaned against his shoulder. "Tell me about California. I've never seen the ocean." They talked late into the night, painting pictures of possible futures. A small town where no one knew their history. A schoolhouse where Sarah could teach without whispers following her. Maybe a ranch where Jonas could raise horses, put his knowledge of the land to peaceful use. Dreams, but no longer impossible ones. 3 days later, they reached the territorial border. Jonas pulled up the wagon, looking at the marker that separated one chapter of their lives from the next. "Second thoughts?" Sarah asked. "No, you?" "None." She straightened her bonnet, smoothed her skirts. "Though I do wonder what awaits us in Colorado. Morton might have poisoned that well too deep to clean." "Only one way to find out." They crossed the border, wheels creaking, Buttercup plodding steadily behind. Whatever awaited them, they'd face it as they'd learned to face everything, together. That evening, in a proper hotel in the first Colorado town, Jonas found Sarah writing at the small desk in her room. She looked up as he entered with their supper tray. "Writing to someone?" "To Martha Washington, letting her know we're safe, that justice was done." Sarah set down her pen. She risked a lot, testifying like that. Her business could suffer. Hey, Martha's tougher than Morton ever was. She'll be fine. They ate in companionable silence, the luxury of a real meal after days of trail food. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Jonas, when this is over, when we're married, I want to write about it. All of it. Jed's investigation, Morton's crimes, what happened to us. Not for revenge, but so people understand how easily good communities can go bad. How one corrupt man with enough charisma can poison an entire town. That could be dangerous. Morton had allies, some still out there. I know, but silence is what allowed him to flourish. If our story can prevent one other town from falling under such a man's spell..." Jonas reached across the table, took her hand. "Then we'll tell it, together. Your words, my memory for details. We'll make sure the truth survives." Sarah's smile was radiant. "I do love you, Jonas Gage. I should have said it sooner, but..." "You said it perfectly," Jonas interrupted. "And I love you. Sarah, have since you stood in that lamplight and told me about your husband's courage. You showed me that fighting for justice still mattered, even when the system fails." They sat holding hands across the dinner table. Two people who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances and chosen to build light together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Colorado held its own trials. Jonas's name still needed clearing, and the shadows of their ordeal would take time to fade. But tonight, in this simple hotel room, they had each other and the promise of all the tomorrows to come. Sarah squeezed his hand. "No matter what happens in Colorado, we'll handle it. We've faced down worse than false records and old lies." "That we have," Jonas agreed, "that we have." Later, as Jonas returned to his own room, he paused at Sarah's door. "Good night, future Mrs. Gage." "Good night, future Mr. Mackenzie Gage," she replied with a laugh. "Mackenzie Gage? I want to honor them both, the man who died seeking justice and the man who helped me find it." Jonas considered this. Sarah Mackenzie Gage has a nice sound to it. "I think so too." As he lay in his bed, Jonas reflected on the strange paths life could take. A drifter accused of corruption, a widow accused of murder, brought together by bread on a porch rail and a shared belief that truth still mattered. Tomorrow, they'd continue toward Colorado and whatever awaited them there. But Jonas no longer feared the future. With Sarah beside him, he could face anything. False accusations, old enemies, new challenges. They'd proven that in Willow Ridge. The lonely widow had offered him bread. He'd given her his last name, or would, soon enough. But more than that, they'd given each other hope, purpose, and a love forged in the fires of adversity. It was, Jonas thought as sleep finally came, more than either of them had dared dream when this journey began. And it was only the beginning.